Well, guys, thanks for joining us, joining me, joining Like a Champion. I'm super excited to have you, and we've been talking about this for a while. But Tom Shelton, Steve Shelton, also known as Uncle and Dad, you guys were my first experience and first understanding of business. In 1982, buying the Ferrari dealership, and I was 5 years old at the time, and that was life for me. It was home away from home was at the dealership, and all the people that worked there, and what a neat way to grow up. A neat way to experience life, and obviously you guys as brothers and partners, and here in South Florida, which is such an electrifying place, and fun place to live. So I thought you guys would be great guests for this show, not just because of the business you're in, but because of the partnership that you had for almost 30 years. And in my line of work, that's a really special and unique thing. And so I'm just super excited to explore that, and all of the different nuances in the years and the ups and the downs. And kind of just wanted to start with you, Tom, and your background before getting into the car business, and becoming Dad's partner, and kind of leading up to that, and just would love to kind of hear your background there.
Well, I worked for a Volkswagen dealership in North Carolina, and I enjoyed that business, and came back to Florida and bought a motorcycle business. And but in the meantime, I was working at getting my real estate license and broker's license, and was actively engaged in the real estate business with a company here, and a partnership in another company. And then the opportunity came to call with the dealership. So Steve was in, I'm going to let him do the talk, but he was in, we weren't thinking of any kind of partnerships. We were just having fun and racing.
And were you actively looking to get out of real estate, or was this more about just something that popped in front of you that was opportunistic and felt like it was maybe meant to be, and it was a good fit for?
No, we weren't actively looking. I knew the way we were doing a lot of racing, would looking for an opportunity, possibly be able to take a tax advantage from our racing, and the opportunity came along.
Dad?
Yeah, so my first real job was with a small advertising agency, which was owned by a friend of our family's for a lot of years, named Bailey Campbell. And he took pity on me because I was selling storm shutters to old ladies in high rises. And any job that came along, I was going to jump on, because that was pretty miserable work. But anyway, I went to work for Bailey, and that lasted for 9 years, until and I worked in most aspects of a small ad agency, which was about production and media and copywriting and creative presentations and all that. And I was involved in a lot of that, and most of that. And then Bailey became ill, and I had to. He made it easy for me to buy the agency while he was going through his tough time, and so that's when Tom and I started talking about this collaboration. Bailey can't remember exact timing, but he was either close to his demise, or he had already passed. But at the end of the day, the timing worked so beautifully for Tom and I, because we were searching for something a little more up our alley, shall we say. And that was certainly up our alley, because we were doing all the amateur road racing and spending a lot of time together doing that. And I bought all his hand-me-down race cars. So he thought it was pretty important to keep me involved. So anyway, that's kind of the intro.
And if memory serves me, you were, after your partner had passed away, you remained in the advertising business, and you sold your business, and you were working for the buyer for a period of time, and maybe that somewhat kind of not that it was a bad situation, but just you felt like it was different. You weren't the owner anymore, and
Well, I mean,
helped to-
the door opened for me when this suitor called me. I'd met him at a seminar in New York, and he called me and said, "Hey, I just got this big account. We got a lot of presence in Florida. Would you consider collaborating with me or selling me your?" We had a nice staff at that point, and a presence in the marketplace, and you know, we weren't lighting it up either. So I mean, and he was a very progressive and medium-sized agency that was headquartered in Atlanta. So, and I sold it to him, and the rest is pretty fortuitous for Tom and I, because I didn't like working for another. When I was my own boss, I got spoiled. So
yeah. I hear that a lot. How did the Ferrari opportunity come across your desk?
Nick Gunther, who was a local attorney with a pretty high-profile firm, had purchased several Ferraris from the previous owners, and he got wind of them wanting to sell, and he came to me one day. Nick was a friend of both Steve and mine, and he asked if I would be interested in purchasing the Ferrari dealership. And I said, I don't know anything about running a car business. And he kind of made a comment. He says, you don't have to learn anything about the car business. It's a Ferrari business. It's an enthusiast business, and you guys would be perfect for it. So that's when I contacted Steve and asked him if he'd be interested in it. And we sort of mulled it over for a little while, and the idea caught some root, and then we proceeded with the purchase of it.
Can you tell me a little bit about where it was? And I seem to recall a pretty modest showroom and facilities.
Bob Gressman and I had done some business because I was always interested in Ferraris, and I had purchased a Dino, and the motor needed some revision, and I pulled the motor out at my house on 11th Court using a tree limb of a, wasn't a very sophisticated way of doing it, but a tree limb on this banyan tree, this ficus tree, and a puller, and I pulled it out and broke the top of the carburetor off, but I got the engine out, and the cam timing belts or chains needed to be revised, and so I took the motor over to him, and it sat there for a long time, and he was doing work back of Lester's Diner. That's where it really got started. Then a gentleman by the name of Phil Baumgarten came along and asked if he wanted to apply for the newly gifted Ferrari North America franchise, because he was just doing service work without really a license with Ferrari to do it. And so they formed a partnership, and then they moved the business to a little next door to a outboard motor repair on 6th Avenue and Andrews Avenue, and it wasn't anything. I mean, it was just a little showroom, and you'd walk out of that showroom, and there was a little back-end service, and then next door to it, some guys cranking up an outboard motor, revving it up. So it wasn't exactly conducive to being a bona fide dealership, and I think they got tired of it because Ferrari started having some problems, and that's how it came about.
And how long were you guys there before you moved to the
Almost.
Federal Highway?
We moved out of there as soon as we could. What, 2 or 3 months later?
Yeah, I think it was 6 months or so, and we identified that place on Federal Highway where the dealership still exists today. And that's kind of interesting when you think about it. You know, here we were in 1983, 82 or 83, and we found what we thought might have been a temporary home. Turned out to be 40 years worth of, of that company's history. And I don't know if they'll ever move from there, because it's a pretty nifty place. They've got it really tweaked. But
Yeah.
and so, the one thing I'll add to what Tom said was, when we bought the company, it was so small that we weren't too spooked about the car business, because we knew we were going to learn it one car at a time anyway.
right.
And one car at a time meant like 3 months would transpire between sales. And so, we couldn't make too many mistakes in in the early going, which was really good. I mean, you'd like to learn all business that way, right? Where your risk is pretty small and, the reward is huge because you're learning with every day, and it's good.
How many cars were you guys selling a year back then, you think, if you had to ballpark it?
10, maybe.
Yeah, 10 used and 10 new, if we were lucky. Because I think one of the reasons that the Baumgarten and Cressman gave up on it was because that the cars were plagued with engine problems, and they had switched from carbureted, very reliable engines over to fuel injected engines, and they were oil burners, and they would use a quart of oil every 100, 200 miles, and then they became plagued with cam belt problems. With the cam belts they were using kept breaking, and motors having mechanical problems. So I think they just threw up their hands, and we didn't know much about it. We didn't do our research when we actually made that purchase, and we didn't know about the problems until we actually got into it, and people started showing up on our doorstep with broken motors and leaking oil and burning oil, and we're just like, oh man, how do we solve this?
So it's 1982, 1983, South Florida, Ferrari business. What is that like?
Non-existent, basically. It was, most people were into the old cars. The new cars had become less desired because of the problems they were having, and they were really underpowered, very underpowered. So they didn't really uphold the traditions of what a Ferrari should be.
Well, Dad, you had a 1970 something 308, the black one. I looked that car up recently. It had like 179 horsepower.
Yeah, it was
a shockingly low amount for what I in my head.
That was not the central focus of that car. The styling was more it had the sex appeal, curb appeal, and the performance wasn't great, and they were temperamental, and as Tom said, we effectively opened the doors to a can of worms, and we're under the gun from the get-go, and then you're learning on the fly with things like warranty claims and everything that you can't pay for all these repairs. The factory has a responsibility, and we were learning about warranty. I mean, frankly didn't know a heck of a lot about parts and service and warranty, and all we were thinking is we bought a business that had a lot of sex appeal, not so much back then as it does today, obviously, but we were blessed with the concept of learning on the fly, where it didn't cost us, where we weren't making big mistakes. We were making mistakes, but they weren't too costly. And so, I mean, the timing couldn't have been better for the two of us.
So I want to explore, because I see and deal with a lot of partnerships, and it's always interesting to see that there's always different reasons why people get into partnerships. Sometimes it's just simply the need for capital, and people can't do it on their own. Sometimes it's friends or family that want to get into business just for fun or nostalgia reasons. But do you find historically that you guys brought different things to the table that complemented each other when it came to running that business and growing that business?
I think we did. We had an enthusiast attitude, and we also had a racing background, and Ferrari had such a storied history of racing.
But I mean, I think you guys have different, like we all have our different skill sets and blind spots just in terms of our own competencies, right? Do you see each other as those competencies complementing each other? I always felt like you were more sales oriented, and when I would come to the dealership in the earlier years before the big Renault, and you had more salespeople, like you were selling cars, and Dad was kind of running fixed ops, and then later on, you were kind of pitching Jaguar for the dealership in '92 and putting on your advertising hat and going out there and kind of dog and pony show. Yeah. And I loved seeing that. It's always fascinating to see how the partnerships, and you bring different things to the table, and the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? And so,
well, I think what Tom was getting at is that we had, I think the way we marketed the company was through motor racing, and it would have been such a different picture had we not been involved in meeting and seeing people on race weekends that, you know, we ended up selling cars to. I mean, for the 30-year run that we had, not just Ferraris, but, you know, of course we had the other franchises later on when we figured out Ferrari wasn't going to be enough to, you know, satisfy our, you know, goals and stuff just by itself. So we kind of jumped into, you know, pitching other franchises where they were in need of representation in other markets, and we got our fair share of those. It was fun, and you know, I think certainly racing helped our visibility and credibility in those efforts.
It became your brand, didn't it?
Sorry,
your name in racing became your brand.
Yeah, that's right.
It wasn't just the brand itself of the franchises you sold, but the Shelton name became synonymous with racing, and really fit in well with the brands that you represented, right?
It's fair to say.
Made you, you know, so unique, and I think, and it almost feels like it happened by accident, but it didn't, right? I mean, you were drawn to Ferrari because of, you know, your desire and sort of for being around cars. I mean, I've heard so many stories growing up about, you know, the different cars that you had when you were, you know, when you were younger and tinkered with and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of funny how it all seemed to work out, but it really, it's an interesting and unique brand.
Well, it was less than a year after the purchase, then we wound up doing our first endurance race together in a car that didn't belong to us, but it was nonetheless a very high-profile Ferrari BB 512 LM, and we ran it in the 12 Hours of Sebring. And that, I mean, I think that established some kind of precedent for the two of us co-piloting, you know, in an endurance event in our own brand, staffed by, or crewed by our staff, you know, or people that were working in the dealership and had lots of, you know, hands-on with those cars. And I always thought that was a great way to launch our co-driving experience, because it was the first time we raced together as, you know, co-drivers and in our own brand. It felt right to me, you know, right from the get-go.
Well, one thing I was wondering before too, just in terms of like the culture of South Florida back then, and I have to imagine you had some interesting characters walking through the door. Being involved with racing and being involved with Ferrari, I mean, I can only imagine you could write a novel.
Yeah, probably turn the camera off for some of that stuff.
I was going to say, can you hum me a few bars without incriminating anyone? Or
it was wild and woolly back then.
Oh boy,
you know,
was it ever!
Bringing you cash and suitcases and everything.
Well, I think you could probably sell cars to people for cash, and you don't have to ask questions like you do now, right?
Not back then you didn't, but a little later on.
One of the things that I was really excited to explore, you know, because you guys were partners for so long, almost 30 years, surely you had ups and downs during that time. And I remember as a kid, I mean, nothing was ever terrible, but there was definitely some tense times when the excise tax on luxury items was passed in 1990. Again, Tom, you touched on Ferrari's really just at early years was not building a great car that was moving units and driving sales for you. Just love to hear a little bit about maybe some of that sort of context and insight, and where and when you felt like things were turning the corner for you, whether it was, you know, internal operations that you had changed or external factors that changed for you that helped, you know, that growth trajectory, and just would love to hear some context behind that if there's any.
I remember the most significant hurdles we had to overcome in the beginning was the quality of the cars. It was the gray market cars that started coming in, and then it was the luxury tax, as you just mentioned. And we had to, the quality of the cars started working itself out with Ferrari, and they came out with the Testarossa in the mid 1980s, and that really kind of saved the company. And they couldn't be brought in under gray market conditions because they were a 12-cylinder car, and it was a lot harder to federalize. But then once we got rolling toward the late 80s, then came the luxury tax. Read my lips, no new taxes, and the next day he signed the luxury tax into effect, which really, when you think about the taxes that we had to add on to the price of the cars, it really then the sales volume actually tapered off again. So we
had to affect margin too, I would imagine.
It absolutely did. Yeah.
It was on amounts over 30,000 that the 10% tax was imposed. So a $100,000 car was a $7,000 bill just for luxury tax. You think about that.
I mean, it's huge, and I think that it's interesting how maybe the average person would look at that and say, "Oh, they're rich people and they can afford that." When in reality, most of the people buying those cars are pretty shrewd and pretty educated. And their mind is, they're thinking, well, the dealer's gonna pay that, or somebody else is gonna pay that, right? And so I know it had a devastating effect on other industries like jewelry and on yachting, right? And so I just remember you never exposed me too much to that stuff. In 1990, I'm 13 years old, but when I asked questions, you answered them honestly, and I can remember feeling that tension, like, this is a problem, and so. Just going to get back through the timeline, it seemed around that time that you got wind that there was going to be a new franchise offered on the west coast of Florida.
Right. Well, we had a friend named Reggie Smith who was, again, we met through motor racing, and he was a member of sort of an inside group of people who knew some people in the Jaguar business, and Jaguar was really in bad shape back then, and they were desperate. They had just been bought by Ford Motor Company, and they were desperately trying to get back to what they call tier 1 sales levels, which is 100,000 cars a year in North America, and that was the key to their buying the business. And it was a mandate from Ford to the Jag execs to get us back there, right? Cars are going to get better, I promise that. And so they had open points, and we learned of the one in Southwest Florida, which originally was Fort Myers, but then got redefined to be Naples, which was a big blessing because the concentration of wealth there was much greater than it was in Fort Myers. So and we pitched it hard. We chased it night and day for nearly a year, as I recall. And like you mentioned, our marketing experience aided in that whole thing. Plus, I think maybe even more significant in that chase was the fact that we were Ferrari dealers, very highly thought of at that time, in the Ferrari system, because they were starting to pay attention to CSI, which is now a big driver of below the line money, they call it.
Customer satisfaction, right?
Yeah. So we didn't have to prove ourselves. It was, at the time, I don't know, they really weren't too formally measuring that stuff, but we were the #1 dealer in North America based on sales volume, and and they had their own way of measuring customer satisfaction because we had a lot of repeat buyers. So it opened the door for us with that franchise and others.
And was there any sort of, when you learned that they're going to put a franchise there, was there any sort of roadmap, or was there any sort of RFP, like it said, no, here's what we want to see from you, or did you just have to just go with instinct and say, I'm just going to go and try to pitch them on why they should award this franchise to Shelton?
We did what we thought was what they wanted to hear. They never said, here's what, they never said, we want to see a proposal, was all they would say. It didn't have to follow a formatted, but what they want to hear is that we have financially qualified, and that we'd identified a location that was going to be suitable for a high-end luxury car, and that we had a plan to staff it and finance it. And you know, we were sort of looking for a way to augment Ferrari's income, because up to that point it was just Ferrari, and
Right.
so we were ready to go out, and I'll let Tom finish the conceptual part of that. Was easy to understand if you looked at our balance sheet and P&L from just Ferrari.
Right.
So,
Well, Reggie came from Palm Beach Motor Cars, and he had also a good alliance with, or rapport with, Land Rover as well. So when we started pitching, Reggie helped us get in front of Land Rover and Jag, and then I'm not sure exactly, you can tell me, but how did we get with Porsche at the time? And
Yeah.
Porsche was struggling. Land Rover had some teething problems, and they weren't building very good cars appropriate for the
They were pretty newly introduced into North America, right?
into the American market, and but Jaguar had fairly established themselves, but then they kind of lost presence with a certain amount of quality problems, and but Steve is the one that kind of put it all together with Reg. I kind of stayed over with Ferrari, but I do remember when we went to talk to some financing arms to find some money to put this all together, with mainly floor plans that needed to be had. This one banker he said right out, he says, "Why don't you guys go get a good Toyota dealership? Because in our perception, Porsche, Jag, and Land Rover are all going to go bankrupt, because Porsche was really on its heels at the time, and I don't know why, but there was the splitting between Porsche and Audi and all of this, and they didn't have a really good game plan, and Porsche had a great reputation, but they were losing market share to other brands, and so do you remember that?
yeah. But the Porsche lash up came not through Reggie, but it came through our motor racing, because we were doing
Right.
some endurance racing with the Porsche
With Porsche.
962,
Yeah.
and you know, we had some visibility in racing to start with, and the fact that we left our core brand, which was Ferrari. They didn't have a car that we could campaign at that time, so Tom sourced this 962, which was the beast to have at that point in time. So this is a very long story made short. The guy in Fort Myers that had Porsche was also a Cadillac dealer, and he resigned the Porsche dealership under pressure from Cadillac. They wanted all the showroom space because they were struggling also. And so he had a choice to make. He resigned. Porsche took back the signage and the parts, and the franchise formally was, surrendered by this guy. His name is Ward, and they're still there. They're a Cadillac dealer in Fort Myers to this day. But we were there talking to a guy named Mike McMahon at the time that was surrendered, and so I just said, "Hey man, we're making it happen in Naples. We'd love to have you guys along for the ride." And he said, "Why don't you come see me in Atlanta next week?" So we flew up there and got a letter of intent like that. I mean, they weren't without a dealer for more than 2 weeks. So our timing, once again, was God sent. We were in the right place, the right time, racing with all these these Porsche people, and had, access to the right people, and it would just happen.
So let's talk about that. You used the word God sent. Some other people would use other words like luck, but I feel like of all the books that I've read with successful entrepreneurs, they all have some sense of humility, that there was some things that happened that played in their favor that was out of their control, right? Because any logical business owner knows you don't control all the factors in your business, right? We don't control everything. It was regulatory factors of the excise tax. You guys had nothing to do with that. You had really nothing to do with what Ferrari makes. And so it sounds to me, and I've always been enamored by this idea that some things that happened, you guys went out and got these franchises, right? You went out and you made the pitch and you made the push and you got it done, but some other things fell into place. The luxury tax got repealed in '93. You were awarded the Naples Jag Porsche Land Rover in 92, right? And so do you feel like that there was luck, or you were blessed with things that just fell into place in the right time with introductions and connections and things like that?
I definitely do believe that it was divinely ordained. And I read a Charles Spurgeon quote just the other day, and I read it to Terry, and it went something like this. And I don't have it exact verbatim, but it says, in the believer's life, there is no such thing as luck. You have to put it away and believe that God ordains everything. And I do believe that that happened. He's ordained everything in our lives, and we don't necessarily always recognize it or give him credit for it. But he was with us the whole way through, no doubt about it in my mind.
So I'm so on board with that. But this interview is probably, we're somewhere in the middle of it. We could fill the rest of it up with examples of what he's talking about. Just that Porsche thing, the timing, and we had four other franchises where timing was everything. It wasn't anything other than being where we needed to be, doing what we were supposed to be doing, and the opportunity was there to capitalize on it. We weren't some, I don't quite know how to explain it, but we weren't the Elon Musk of the car business, for sure. We just were there doing what we do and trying to do it honestly and above board, and treating our customers the way they deserve to be treated, and it all worked out.
And then 95, Land Rover comes along for Fort Lauderdale. Obviously, you've already got an existing relationship there. So it seems like the trajectory from 1990 with the luxury tax, and then Naples hitting, and then the repeal, and then Land Rover hitting, and then Fort Myers in 2000, which was perhaps a little more, sort of mixed, not quite as gangbusters as the Naples store, the Land Rover store, but it's really amazing to see that sort of like the progression of things going from really quite uncertain to really very successful enterprise. And so
well, to piggyback on that, it's one of those be careful what you wish for things. With Audi, for example, we were ahead of the curve on getting that franchise and putting it in Fort Myers. It was our only option because Audi and Naples had already been claimed 10 years prior, and so we were 10 years, maybe 3, 4, 5 years too early in Fort Myers, because they don't, they have a term in the car business called UIO, and if you don't have a certain number of units in operation, UIOs, in a marketplace, it's not likely you could support a fixed ops business, parts and service. And they didn't have that threshold yet, and yet we said, hey, we got a chance to get Jag in Fort Myers. We need a stablemate. Let's go after Audi and see what they say. And we opened the doors, and we did lose money for a while, and we gutted it out, and we ran it very lean and mean. But in the end, the products, I think, saved us. They started to ramp up their production and get a little more. Audi spent a lot of money to create their brand image, which was, all about precision. Sort of BMW takeoff of, the experience of driving, and they fulfilled that promise, and the public started buying more of those cars. They got to the tier 1 threshold the time we were involved with, during the time we were involved with them. And if you remember, some people watching or listening to this might remember when the death sentence was pronounced on 60 Minutes with sudden instant acceleration with Audi, if you remember that. And they almost ceased to exist in North America because of that false claim that some lawyer was able to,
How did you go about hiring and bringing in people and treating them and making them feel appreciated. How much do you think that really added value to in
You wanna go?
in your
No, you
enterprise?
take it.
Do I need to? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the people make the business, not,
Right.
it's the only thing we can control. We don't control the product, and we can control who we surround ourselves with. And we were beyond fortunate to find, just a great cadre of people who thought like we did and said, these guys want to do it right, and they might be in the minority in the car business, in South Florida. And above all, we really did want to do it right. And, we had some problems with cars and customers that we ended up reaching in our pocket and buying the car back just to solve a problem and maintain credibility. And it didn't take long before the people that worked with us got the fever too. And they saw we were not going to sacrifice, integrity. And I think it just built on itself. And we had people that worked with us for a long, long time. And they tell us still to this day, it was great working with you guys. I'm not patting ourselves on the back so much as I am them, because they realized what we were doing and it kept them in the saddle. Does that satisfy your
Absolutely, no
memory?
doubt. The personnel and the people you have working with you are really the backbone of the store. And like he said, it's not the product, and it's. I'll tell you a little sidebar here. We hired some personnel. We got what they call closed captive financing. That would be the manufacturer offering a certain amount of financing paper on the cars, and we hired this one person who came highly recommended. This person did a great job with closing deals and this and that, and she came back one day and she said, I think I scored the biggest home run I've ever scored in financing. And I said, what do you mean? She says, I was able to get the highest interest rate possible that we could get on these people that came in the store. And I said, did they qualify for a lesser amount? Oh yeah. And I said, well, you go call them back up, tell them you're going to rework the paperwork, and we're going to give them the lowest possible interest rate that the manufacturer would approve. And she looked dumbfounded and was very upset, so we had to part company with that type of person. It wasn't about how to gouge the people that came in our store. It was how to give them as much quality and attention that we could do. And that always stuck out in my mind, is how we ran the store. Of course, that example made its way through the people in the store about how we wanted to conduct business.
You know the 20 group story, right, son? We had 20 groups are a group of 18, 19, 20 dealers who, in different markets that have different challenges, and they pool their financial information and they do a composite, and they show who's kind of leading the pack and, gross profits and, overhead in the service department, or,
right. Hiring challenges.
And we just kind of trying to take best practices, and every time I'd go to a 20 group meeting and listen to the dialogue, it's like, the Sheltons are leaving so much on the table in F&I, finance and insurance.
Yes.
You guys you're walking away from so much money, and I'm thinking, well, maybe not. We got a lot of repeat customers who never felt when they came to trade their car back in that, God, I'm so far underwater. It's you guys' fault. You kind of threw me under the bus in the beginning. I didn't realize it, but I don't think if we had any of those, it would be news to me. And
Pardon me.
it's one of those, decisions you make and say, okay, I'm not going to go to town on everybody. I'm going to do what's fair and right. And you might sound like a saints here sitting here talking to you, but that was it. That was the goal.
Yeah, I think that reputation still survives, and still get people that I run into that used to work at the store or spend a lot of time there, bought cars, and I think that's It's amazing. People remember that. You know, people remember that, and certainly in the car business, it makes you, you know, I would say quite unique in general. And trying to buy a car during COVID was quite a unique experience when supply chain was disrupted. And but I want to kind of switch gears on just being a franchised car dealer, and obviously dealing with manufacturers. Tom, I'd like to start with you, and just what that's like. What makes it unique to other businesses, and what are some of the challenges there? Because you know you clearly have oftentimes different interests, but you have a lot of capital at risk, and you're really to a large degree you're at their mercy, right, for allocation and the quality of the product, and you know the margin, and a lot of the holdback in terms of the money that they held back at sale, and on trying to get, you know, back then it was. And they changed the terminology over the years, but would love to hear about those challenges and how you dealt with them. And
Well, you know, having the franchise agreement with the manufacturer was the backbone of how you did business in the sports car business or the high-end business, because you were the recognized dealer for parts, service, and for new cars. And it also brought in the used car business as well. Mm-hmm. So what separated us from the auto toy store or the whatever other people that we were in competition with for selling used cars and was that we had the franchise and we were recognized by the manufacturer.
Mm-hmm. And was it ever challenging dealing with the manufacturers when it came to just allocation or any of the requirements that they had of you? You know, because at the end of the day, I think the way the laws are set up, they weren't able to just go out and open their own store, you know, down the street, or they had their own restrictions too. So sometimes it seems to me like maybe your interests weren't 100% aligned together. So I would imagine that would present some challenges.
Well, we had to meet their standards, and those standards were pretty high in a lot of respects. We had to maintain the facility standards, and as Steve mentioned before, we had a customer satisfaction level that we had to maintain before we got paid the full amount of gross profit on the car, and service standards, and it all kind of came together with regard to what we had to do under that franchise agreement. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always a pleasant situation. Sometimes we thought that they were out of line or they were overbearing, but that's the way it had to be operated.
We saw a full array of relationships, the full array of Ferrari being at one extreme, limited production, high demand, high ticket item with a nice gross profit in it, typically a waiting list, and they exerted a lot of pressure on us to sell in our own market area, which was
right.
not bad, but the allocation depended on executing on that demand. But on the other end of the scale, we had franchises that were trying to get their footing again. There was a lot more congenial relationship with the manufacturer because we were working together to get something going on, right? And we had that. We were right in that, you know, that time frame where these franchises were going to live or die. Literally, Jag was, you know, on life support when we took it over, and the other dealers that we met with frequently were feeling the pain that we were feeling, and many of them felt it for a lot longer than we did because they'd been with them since the 70s and 80s, and you know that was the same was you know, with Porsche, with riding that up and down and trying to get that back. So I felt like we had our best and most honest dialogue and give and take with the manufacturers that were hurting, because we were really dependent on each other. And whereas Ferrari, you know, they were a bit on the arrogant side, to be honest, and a little bit Italian mentality was, you know, sometimes tough to take. Tom knew better about that than I did because he was more focused on Ferrari, and I was, you know, working on some other things on the West Coast. But I would say, from my perspective, I enjoyed the business more when the manufacturers we needed us. They needed us to, you know, work with them and take a load of cars when you really didn't maybe need it or want it, but they needed you to take it. So we ended up, you know, being that dealer for them, and they knew it. And they stayed with us through thick and thin because of that. We left a lot of money on the table by having cars on the lot that we didn't need, but we knew we were, you know, it was the give and take I'm talking about.
Right. I remember we got a load of Ferraris that were having problem selling, and they unloaded a truckload on them, and they expected us to sell them. And I said, well, this car is a little difficult. What is the expected gross profit out of this? And he said, we don't care. You just sell them. If you have to take a loss, we want them out the door. So we did take a loss on certain cars, and we did make $1,000 gross profit, which wasn't anything back then. After you had your marketing fees and you paid your facilities, and there was give and take. But the one thing that stands out in my mind is that when they brought some concepts, the Italians brought some concepts of dealer relations, and they started a dealer council. And there was, out of 35 dealers, only 3 dealers invited to be on their dealer council, and we happened to be one of them. And I attended all of the meetings and gave them my input. So it really tightened our relationship, not only with our store and them, but with all of the rest of the dealers and Ferrari North America, because it was getting fractured at times when they started putting the heavy hand down. So that was a good situation for all of us.
Yeah, that working hand in glove with those guys.
Yeah.
I served on dealer council for Land Rover and Jag, and you know, you definitely get more of a feeling of being on the inside of decisions that are made that affect dealers. Mm-hmm. And you either get tattooed with supporting a bad idea, or you get, you know, lifted up when you support an idea that brings more money into the dealership for your fellow retailers. And so there were a lot of trips overseas, you know, to see what was going on in the factory. Tom and Ferrari and me and Jag and Land Rover and Porsche, and just being in the know, you know, trying to immerse ourselves in it and really understand where the businesses were headed.
Seems like there's a lot there, and I feel like the competing sort of interest and motivations of the manufacturer, sometimes it can conflict with the dealer, and the requirements on you for the facilities, and, you know, keeping more inventory perhaps than you need at the time, and I can see where that could be, you know, that could be challenging. I want to touch a little bit back to, you know, the personal side of the partnership. And again, I think I alluded to this earlier, but you know, just naturally in the M&A advisory business, we deal with a lot of partnerships, we deal with a lot of family businesses, and you see a lot of conflict there. And I think conflict is natural. Obviously, things are going to come up where you've had disagreement or you know, difference of opinions, and to be partners for almost 3 decades. I mean, surely you had conflict, and I'm really, as a psych guy too, fascinated how you dealt with that. Was there a process in which you did that? I mean, how did you work through where you had, you know, situations where, especially in the late 80s and early 90s, things are tough, things are tight. How did you deal with conflict and make sure that you got aligned on your path forward?
Between the two of us, I think we had respect for each other and each other's opinions, and we were able to talk it out and come up to some conclusions about what we wanted to do when it came to selling the stores, if that's what you mean. And so that was it. I mean, we got along pretty well. There's a couple of rub spots, but not many at all. So
I think we saw life through the same lens, really. We were fortunate to be in the position we were in, and we were trying to take care of it as best we could. If we had a dust up, we'd go off and rassafras on our own, and then maybe go at it again the next day or something when we had a little time to think about it. But we always wanted the same things. That was a business that we were proud of, surrounded by people and that we enjoyed working with, and we wanted to make money. And so I think we were blessed because we weren't under the same roof every day for 30 years. We had those dealerships across the way, and you know, I was over there quite a bit, and Tom was mainly on the east side, but when he was over there, I was over here. So, you know, we weren't under each other's foot.
Right.
And we kind of trusted each other a lot. You know, hey, I know you're working in my best interest, and vice versa. So, yeah, I didn't really see the miracle in it until after it was all over.
Yeah.
And people say, "Yeah, you and your brother were partner for 30 years." And I said, "Yeah." So you're still friends? I say, "Heck yeah, he's my best friend." You know.
That's so neat. I remember when I was getting my master's at Nova, and one of the neat things that they do there, they're always having guest speakers come in, entrepreneurs. And Tommy Miller came in one day, and I just, you know, was quiet and obviously enjoyed hearing him tell his story. And he got to the end and do Q&A. And he said, yes, sir. What's your name? I said, I'm Wes. You know, he knew who I was. I said, what's it like working with your brother? And he got a little chuckle out of it and you know, said his little bit. But I like you said years later, mostly as a result of, you know, my work, I really appreciate it more and more now. And it's become sort of a subtopic of interest of mine, of conflict resolution. And if you think about it, I think as a country, we've gotten really bad at being able to manage conflict in even our most personal relationships, you know, with our spouses, with our kids. You know, we text message instead of sitting down and talking about things, and we don't have a compass, right? We instead of, you know, praying about it and having some sort of middle ground as to, like, our guideline as to what manages this relationship. And so I pay a lot of attention to that. And so thankfully, as part of this family, I'm really thankful that you guys were able to work through, you know, disagreements that you had, because as human beings, that's inevitable, right? In any relationship, let alone a business relationship of that many years, it's going to happen. And so I was like kind of exploring that, and what I would like to hear, you know, just following the timeline, you know, what really started driving that decision to sell? When did you guys kind of realize, like, you know, they always say everything's for sale, right? And certainly get that, and you've got to exit somehow. Tom, would love to hear kind of, you know, when you think that epiphany started to happen, because you guys weren't old. You weren't really at Dad, I think you were 58, and Tom 62 or 3 at the time, and both in good health now, let alone then. And so certainly that wasn't the driving decision. So I would love to hear kind of what that thought process was like.
We never even talked about selling until we got approached, until several suitors started approaching us. And we looked at least in my mind, we looked at capital. We were first-gen dealers. We didn't get the dealerships from our dad. So we had three locations that we had to constantly keep infrastructure improvements because the manufacturers required it. And as I said, in my mind, it required a substantial amount of capital contributions. And Steve and I didn't really want to continue to borrow money. We had with floor plans of Porsche, and you can imagine Ferrari, and all of them were Highline. We had a very substantial floor plan. It wasn't like having 2 Chevy stores. So each unit had a floor plan of at least $100,000 on the average, or significantly more at the time, and it required a lot more capital to be borrowed. We knew that we were going to be coming under pressure from Ferarri to improve our facility in Fort Lauderdale. We had been assembling the properties to our north and south to make room for the capital improvements we needed, because they're bringing out several new units. And so it was time to kind of take a look at the first suitor, which happened to be a group that came in, and they made a pass at us at one point, and we rejected it, I think maybe a year or two earlier. Then they came back and made another pass, and with a much higher amount. So we sat down and talked about it. And that's how we kind of, it wasn't like we're looking to sell because we were having second thoughts or financial issues. It wasn't that way at all.
So I think for the average viewer may not understand, the car business requires a lot of capital, right? You talked about the floor plan, which is financing of the vehicles that you're selling, new and used, but also facilities, right? Substantial. Like that was kind of the day and age that I remember that the manufacturers are really pushing dealers to build Taj Mahals, right? In big markets, especially, they want you to build these big places so people are more inclined to come in and buy cars. And so unless you're absolutely flush with cash, you've got to borrow money to do that, right? And that involves risk. And so if I'm reading you right, that's kind of one of the driving forces, is the pressure to build bigger facilities without really any guarantee or promise that you're going to make more money, right?
Steve always said we had to buy their market share, our manufacturer's market share, with our money, by the facility improvements.
That's the way the car business rolls today. I mean, it's shelf space, it's elegant surroundings that complement the cars, and the real estate has to be pretty prime. If you're selling high ticket stuff, you can't be you can't be out of the mainstream. And so we looked at, I still remember the capex we were looking at to do all the things we were being asked to do, and who was asking us to do them or requiring us to do them. And it was, without knowing exactly what the real estate would cost, but it would require $43 million, I think was the number we were, we had, and we weren't debt free by any stretch of the imagination. And we thought, well, even if we're doing this irresponsibly and not thinking of future generations of Sheltons who might want to be in the car business, it wasn't the thing to do. We're just, even if we did it and managed to hang on, the manufacturers will, and they still will, the manufacturers will take all they can get from you and then turn around and require more. And by the time the paint dries on your latest renovation, they've got a new corporate ID that you're going to have to follow in order to get the below the line money. So that's why I think public companies like AutoNation are buying dealerships, because they can do it. They got a whole war chest of money, and the return on investment is not the focus, it's the stock price. And the two are somewhat related, but somehow they make it work, and they overpay for dealerships and drive guys like Tom and I to retirement. Not that we were, suffering in the process, but we built that business in order to, to hang on to it for a while. We didn't want to borrow any more money, as Tom said. And I'm not too sure we could have borrowed all that money. We had a pretty good reputation, but there was a certain amount of risk, threshold that the banks were probably going to say, I don't see it.
I'll never forget the conversation I had with Paul Berryman from SunTrust. He said, "You are our single best customer. You now have $62 million borrowed."
Yeah.
And I said, "Paul, I don't like the sound of that. That's kind of scary when you sit back and think about it. What if there was a big economic collapse?
Yeah.
Then where are we, So I think that started the process of considering these offers that were coming.
Yeah, it's pretty daunting when you have like a bad month. The
Yeah.
economy does a hiccup, has some kind of, COVID. Not that we were around in COVID, but
Well, 2008 when you sold.
yeah. Well, that's right. That
was-
that was a pretty big deal, but it doesn't take many months. We didn't have a lot of cash reserves. I remember. I'll say this now because we're not we're not accountable for it anymore. But we had certain capital thresholds we had to maintain with franchises to be, and we had to submit the statements, and we would run over to Ferarri and borrow $1 million, take it over and put it in the bank account for Audi and meet that obligation, and then it was catch can with the cash, and
Right.
it was nail biting time.
Uh-huh.
Well, let's talk about the M&A process. I think because a lot of our viewing audience is hyper focused on that, because there's a lot that it's not really known about it, and if you've never been through it, we've got. It's part of what the podcast provides, is really interviewing entrepreneurs that have sold and been through that M&A process and what they've learned. And what just curious as to what you felt like. So you went through 3 separate transactions, right? In 2004 on the West Coast, in 2006 with Land Rover, and 2008 with Ferrari here on the East Coast. And I think we'd start with you, Dad. What do you think, if you started high level, what did you think you learned in that process of selling the businesses that
Well,
maybe you didn't know going in?
I learned not to try to put feathers in your nest or anything, but I learned that we did it backwards. And if I was doing it by myself, which I wasn't, but I think Tom might agree that we should have had M&A help from the get-go, because we did stumble in the first 2 transactions and left some money on the table. I don't mean we stumbled and didn't close the deal, but we closed the deal and we left some money on the table because we didn't have experience selling, and we didn't have any experience buying except the one Ferrari store. The rest of the Shelton enterprise was all on letters of intent from the manufacturer. So we bought one little store at one point in time in the 1980s when we knew literally nothing, and then we sold everything in a tight window when we didn't know what we needed to know about selling. And I wish we'd have had a little more of your kind of guidance and Dan's guidance because we probably could have been sharper by the end. I know we would have been sharper by the end, and we would have saved some money in the first 2 transactions. First one is to a private individual, as you know, and the second one was to a public company, and they had just finished closing on their 45th dealership that month or something, right?
Yeah.
And
they had a whole team of
and they had a whole team of guys.
Green Berets,
Yeah, it was. We were overwhelmed. But so I mean,
Excuse me. I don't know if I completely agree with that. The statement we trusted the 2 first 2 buyers that we did business with. They came with a certain amount of honesty and integrity, and I had known Terry Taylor Group. I knew him from motorcycle days, and he always was honest and straightforward. And when he came through the door and the second time, I just trusted him. Steve had a lot of friends at AutoNation by virtue of his contacts, and they came in and made some offers. Then they upped it a little bit, and we trusted the way they had done business. And I don't think that we were going to be filleted, so to speak, not like the last transaction. And I trusted him. Steve was mainly handling the relations between AutoNation and the Land Rover, and so those just kind of fell in place. I felt like we got fair prices based on multiples, and we could have left some money on the table by grinding it, but I don't know if the transaction would have gone as smoothly.
Well, the thing that sticks in my memory, so there's a clause in a sales contract where you have to declare your used car inventory for sale or not for sale. So we declare and we put a value on it. What you have to remember is that value is only good that day. And we give the guy 30 days before closing to say whether he wants to use cars. And the thing that I learned is that, you know, that gives the guy way too much time for the values to drift around. And if you wait till closing day, the guy that's going to own those cars as the used car manager works for his new boss 10 minutes later. We're his boss 10 minutes prior, and he wants to be in those used. And we had a couple in the first transaction. We had a couple $1 million in used cars, maybe as much as $3 million, which turned into. It wasn't anything that he did dishonest. I didn't mean to imply that earlier, but we weren't seasoned enough to say, look, you got to declare used cars, you want them or you don't, because we're going to wholesale them tomorrow if you don't want them.
And value's subjective,
Oh,
right?
yeah, I
Like,
mean,
so
they
it's not
float
like
around.
he's wrong or right necessarily,
Yeah.
but there's gray area of value, right?
Wes,
So
I'm going to need to take a break.
And you're relying
What's
on
that?
the
I
fact.
need to take a break. for a
Okay.
minute. I'm sorry.
yeah, good.
Yeah,
no
I'm
problem.
sorry. I need to take a break. Yeah.
Well, so you guys had a pretty world-renowned restoration shop.
And that's
Right.
what got us over the hump, you know, when we weren't doing new car sales, the restoration, and we made a business out of being the best we could be at selling used Ferraris. Pre-owned, they like to call it.
Am I right in saying that Enzo's death brought about the
It did.
run-up in values?
It did. He died in '87, and values went right up until we had that recession of sorts in the early '90s, along with the luxury tax. That
Depressive values.
yeah, the values dropped off significantly with the older cars, but then they came back with a vengeance toward the middle to late '90s. So there was a period of about 3 or 4 years that they just kind of tapered off.
But
Yeah.
it did help us get over the hump because it was a little newfound, you know, segment of the business that we kind of had a little inkling of what was going on, but Tom developed this, you know, even other brand, you know, collectibles that it feathered our nest at a time we really needed it, and beyond.
And race cars.
Yeah.
I would, if I liked the race car, I bought it and resold it, and we made some nice profits on it. These used race cars that we sold. I bought a GT40. I sold a Jim Jagger. Made a really handsome profit off of it. McLaren and Formula 5000, and remember the Formula One car?
The Alpha Formula
The
One.
Alpha Formula One car
Remember
they
that?
sent up to Stewart to put together and get it running, and
Yeah. Got to drive that in a vintage race.
yeah, we did.
And that was
Yeah.
a crowd pleaser, buddy. The people were hanging over the fence listening to that 12.
Tommy and I were there.
I mean, it was just,
Steve
Yeah,
brought
you-
his buddies down from college.
No, we flew up in my airplane to Road Atlanta to do that little venue that
Did we?
weekend. Don't you remember?
I remember being there. I don't know if I remember being in your airplane. Maybe
Yeah.
we flew a lot in your airplane.
Yeah.
So, but so just to drill down further with the restoration shop, like you bought that dealership, and Al Roberts was there,
Yeah.
and he was there when you sold it in 2008,
there.
and he's
Still
still
there.
there at 80 something years old.
84 or 5. I
He,
think.
at this point, he's got to be known around the world for his work.
Oh, he's-
right.
oh yeah.
World renowned.
He's. I mean,
Yeah.
to me, walking into his shop back there at 5750 North Federal, he was like a savant, you know, and you could eat off the floors.
No,
in
he
there.
was very
And
meticulous. Everything was just perfectly laid out.
I certainly don't have the appreciation then that I do now for what a museum that place was of just knowledge, let alone the work that he did and some of the cars that came out of there for your customers. I mean, what a neat place. So one thing I wanted to touch on that I did not allude to before is a lot of people that are sitting in your seats there credit mentors for getting where they got to in life. People that invested time and energy to help guide them as business people and entrepreneurs. And I would just love to hear if you guys had somebody. Dad, I know Bailey was very near and dear to you and took you in some early years where you felt like you were trying to find your way as an adult and a business person, and provide for your family, and the fact that you still talk about him like you do and I would just love to hear a little bit about Bailey.
Yeah.
And
well, he along with my brother here, was a great guiding light for me. He was you've heard the term taskmaster. Bailey was a real, militaristic, feet on the line, do what you say what you do, be on time, value other people's time, tell the truth always. He was by the book, and he was hard to get along with sometimes because I was non-compliant at times, and he made sure that I knew that our relationship would not continue unless I did it his way. And I credit him for a lot of the lessons I learned about accountability and just being responsible as a business guy. And then my brother was a big guiding light for me too. When you're 5 years younger, you got to feel for that. Your brother's just almost the same separation in age, and you're looking at that. I'm going to be doing that in 5 years. I mean, not just but so I would say we had a great grandfather too, he was salt of the earth, up by the bootstraps, third grade education, and managed to be chairman of the board of two pretty big corporations by the time he was 60 years old. And I mean, he read the Wall Street Journal every day, wore a three-piece suit every single day of his life except for when he was playing golf.
Pretty amazing man.
Yeah, and a very frugal, supported his community, his church, his family. I mean, he was quite a character too.
Steve was always very detail oriented. He may have learned that from Bailey. Numbers oriented. I was a little bit more into the fun side of it, you know what I mean? But Steve always looked at the detail of it, and made a lot of enhancements in the business with regard to how we did things. And I got to compliment him on that.
And so
Still is.
you're kind of talking about some of the things I was talking about, wanted to dig into earlier, is like how you complemented each other, and the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and which I love. Tom, do you feel like that you had a mentor that helped expedite? Actually, Bob Dennison, who was my first guest in the reintroduction of the podcast, Pete talked to me privately about how he was introduced and accepted into YPO, which is a big sort of executive networking group that's very exclusive. And he said literally the first thing they asked him when he walked in is like, "Who's your coach? Who's your business coach?" And he was like, Don Shula. I don't he didn't have an answer to that, and didn't even know that was a thing. And they were like, all of us have coaches. You need to have a coach. So to me, a coach is just a formal mentor. And do you feel like anybody fit that criteria for you?
I'm not so sure that somebody comes to mind right now. Spiritually speaking, I had a lot of mentors. Dan's grandfather, John Morris, was an amazing man that kind of put the spiritual aspect on life, and how to do life. And But business-wise, I never really worked for somebody that long, if you know what I mean. Owned the motorcycle dealership, got my real estate license, moved into the Ferrari business, and that was kind of the way it was. But I never really got coached by anybody.
I certainly think that life and business overlap, right? So
They overlap,
if
definitely.
somebody's teaching you how to treat other people the right
Exactly.
way, and
Yeah.
let your yes be yes and let your no be no.
Exactly.
Like, yeah, I certainly think that would qualify. And to me, if you get business coaching out of that too, that's just gravy, right? Because I don't think you can be a great person in business and be a lousy person, and really those things hold true. I think you've got to be strong. It's at least the way that we would want to conduct ourselves and want to be able to hang our hat and sleep at night. And so I just love the phrase, it takes a village, because now, being a father of teenagers, I love dealing with other parents, like specifically friends of my kids, and interacting with them and helping collaborate with them. How do we handle situations that pop up? How do we properly parent our kids and reinforce what it is that you're trying to tell your kids and what I'm trying to tell mine, and be consistent in that application and reinforce those things. And so I think mentors sort of play a part in that. But just sort of kind of like rounding out the whole thing, I would love to hear a little bit, starting with you, Dad. Is there a book that you would recommend that you feel like you...
A business book would be Good to Great. I mean, I think everybody was fascinated by the concepts in that book, and having the right people on the bus before it pulls away from the station was a metaphor which I thought kind of stuck with me, because it's been 20 years since I read that book. And I remember reading it, then I remember listening to the tape on my back and forths to Naples, on those Monday mornings, because I couldn't commit everything to memory that it was covering, and it was, and there's been a number of books along the way, but I read for recreation too, mostly now. But back then I was reading, Good to Great, and lots of books like that. But and there's so much literature out there. Your last book is your best book.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, like The Wager I just finished a couple months ago, which stuck with me. It was about a piece of history and a shipwreck, and guys that were explorers and trying to head off some Spanish galleons and steal all their gold, but it was true. And it was about how to survive back then. I like that, but so those.
It's funny you say Good to Great by Jim Collins. And for those who are uninitiated, Good to Great takes two companies in multiple different sectors and compares the difference between the companies that achieved good things versus ones that achieved great things, right? And said, what was the difference and what defined those two companies, and what made the great companies great versus the good ones only good. And I too read that book when it came out 20 years ago, or however long ago, maybe longer. And I got to this section of that book that I still remember, and it talked about the level 5 leader. It's like, who are the leaders of these companies and what makes them great versus good? And when I first got out of school, my sort of, I guess, the picture in my head of a stereotypical CEO, successful CEO, was almost dystopic, like rule with an iron fist and swashbuckling and cutting jobs and and doing anything in the name of profit, which I didn't admire at all, but felt like, based on what I had heard and was fed in the news, was the standard. And you go to Good to Great, and they talk about the level 5 leader and the humility of those leaders and how they accepted responsibility for failure, and they took great care and great stock in taking care of their people and giving credit to their people when credit was due, and nurturing those relationships. Not only that, but of their successors, right? Not just making the company dependent on them, but making sure if something happened to them or when they were ready to retire, that company was set up for success. And that made me naturally think of you guys. So I found reading that book was so comforting, in that the example that I had been given of business leadership was not an anomaly. It was not the exception. It was really the norm, and what I had been led to believe was maybe perhaps an ideal that was not, you know, the only path to success and, you know, profitable earnings calls, you know what I mean? And so that's an amazing legacy that book left, and I think he had another book called Built to Last, but yeah, Jim Collins, great author. Tom?
Well, outside of the Bible, I've always read adventure books dealing with flying, something like that, the things that I was interested in. But I'm reading a book now that has really captured my imagination and the sacrifices that people make to bring the Word of God to such remote places, and they use their flying abilities and talents. And it's a segment of different stories about how these guys went into the jungle down into the bottom regions of the United States, over in the Far East, and these people that had never seen another human being, that were kind of cannibalistic and whatnot, and they would scope out these areas where they could put a landing strip at the top of a mountain that was so short and so narrow that you wouldn't think you could land an airplane on it, but they did it. And they brought in supplies and food and Bibles translated, and they would jump off with these natives, and some of them got killed, and they sacrificed their lives for other people and their sense of duty to the Lord to bring the Word of God to these people that never imagined it, and how these people, that once they received this word of how God loved them and how much He cared for them, that they became totally different people, that the tribes hated each other, and they would go to war against each other. Now in this particular region where they did all of this, they love each other, they're helping each other, they grow food for each other instead of killing each other. It's amazing to see the sacrifices that these pilots and their families made to bring the love of the Lord to them, and how it transformed the whole region. It's really amazing.
That is amazing. So sometimes we ask this question, but if you had an alternate career and you started all over, knowing what you know now, and you had to go out and make a living, is there something else that you, for instance, I got asked this question on another podcast one time, and I had always had this a little bit of a daydream, being a sports psychologist.
Psychologist?
I remember before I went to college, you had told me that when you went to University of Oklahoma, you really enjoyed psychology, and it was a class that really engaged you, and it did for me, and so much so that I majored in it in undergrad. And I read a book by Dr. Bob Rotella called Golf is Not a Game of Great, and it was filled with these great stories of Ben Hogan, and Ben was a master of golf and the mental game of golf, and he was, but also a very mechanical player. He was keenly aware and was kind of considered to be somewhat of a genius of his time, and I was always fascinated with that. And I think it's an extremely niche-y business, but I believe that the mental aspects of sports is, I mean, I think that you both know as professional athletes in racing, how important the mental aspect is. And so I just feel like I would be absolutely captivated by that line of work. And so I just wondered, I'm catching you guys off guard, but if there was ever an alternate universe and you're starting over and you're 20 years old and you get to go get a postgraduate degree and start a career, like, you know, is there a daydream, like commercial pilot or, you know, fighter pilot or, you know, any of those types of things?
No, I don't think I would do anything differently, because there's a verse in the Bible that says, "Delight in the Lord, and He shall give you the desires of your heart." I can remember being in college, wanting to be in the car business, didn't know how to go about it, how to get into it. And the other thing was I wanted to be a race car driver. And those things kind of led my career path. And I don't think I would change a thing. No, I wouldn't want to change anything career-wise.
You guys always loved cars, right? I mean, that was the stories that I've always heard, is that you loved cars, and the smell of motor oil and burnt rubber and all those things. So that doesn't surprise me, that answer, at all. And I'm actually happy for you, because that's a life well lived right there. Dad?
Well, as a kid growing up, I always wanted to be a football star, and of course, my frame and level of
You're like
talent,
the Dolphins coach.
physical talent. I mean, I gave up on that real early. But what caught my attention was, I've said it to you many times, Tom took me to not many people know the term gymkhana, but it's a performance, lap time,
Kind of
fast lap
autocross.
time. Yeah, it's like an autocross with cones and everything. He took me over there, and I don't think he ever dreamed that it would light a fire in me the way football might have, that as an alternative life. But turns out football is a very short-lived career mostly, and I had what I actually felt like I was pretty good at. I was not a good football player, never would have been. I just romanticized being, as being the star guy making all the touchdowns and getting the Heisman Trophy or whatever. But I latched on to motor racing, and that avocation coupled with my vocation was, most guys would kill for that. I used to get up and go, today I'm going to get to go to the racetrack and test a car or race a car, or I'm going to go to the dealership and, make some money, or it just, I tell people to this day, that I had the charmed life. I mean, I did exactly what guys like me would kill to do, but didn't get a chance.
Mm-hmm.
We represented some of the most sexiest brands on the planet. We got to go to all these fancy, places in Europe and Formula One races and hobnob with, the drivers, and we then became some of those, not Formula One level drivers, but, we were racing some pretty sophisticated stuff. And, how do you beat that? How could you possibly? You're racing to make money for your business, and it worked. Mm-hmm. Right?
Exactly.
Sold a bunch of cars to people that we raced with, and, were fans of racing, and it paid for our fun. And then some.
What was the high moment of your racing dealership career together? What would you say?
Well, we finished on the podium in a pretty good sized IMSA race in the 962.
In '88?
Yeah.
It was 87 or 80?
87, I think. But
Something.
you know what? We had too many near misses.
Yeah,
we could tell you about, like super disappointing outcomes, and from the big cars, the IMSA cars, to the Pro Formula Atlantic, and the Indy Lights thing, and we had some really potentially great finishes. Didn't happen or go our way, but but I think with Tom on the podium at Road Atlanta, with standing next to Hobart and Bell, and I think Price Cobb.
The heyday.
Price Cobb,
IMSA
and who was his co-driver. So we were on the podium with the likes of those guys, and that was pretty big doings.
Yeah.
In the heyday of IMSA, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the late '80s with
It
the
was the
962s
heyday
and the
of IMSA,
Nissans and the
Right.
Group 44 Jags, and
All that.
I mean, that's a neat thing for a privateer.
we still have the photographs of it.
Yeah.
As proof.
So this is maybe a little bit of a unique question, but I don't know if you guys have ever seen the series on Netflix, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, with Jerry Seinfeld. And as you know, Jerry is a big car junkie, and he goes and picks up a comedian du jour in a specific car that he feels like represents them. And they take him a coffee and they just talk, and it's a lovely show, and it's 30, 40 minutes and a lot of giggles. But like, if Jerry Seinfeld's picking you up in a car that represents who you are as a person. What car is that?
Oh, nice. I don't know. It would be something.
Or it could just be, you know, your go-to favorite.
My favorite
classic
car of all
all-time.
time was a 288 GTO by Ferrari, and it was built in '85, I think, wasn't it, Tom?
We sold more of those cars than any other Ferrari dealership. Not because we were allocated more. It just that we just had the audience, the people we had developed relationships with that wanted them. I think we sold like 6 or 7 of them.
I mean, they were just.
I had to buy them from the other dealers.
I mean, it was just a
They couldn't sell 'em.
fantastic car to drive
it was
to. I mean,
amazing.
it just loaded with power,
Yeah.
explosive power, and sound. You know, and a little flame out the exhaust. I mean, it was magic, and
Yeah.
the styling was. You know, you know what a 288 GTO looks like. It's you know,
Yeah.
I think it's Ferrari's finest effort, but I'm not current with Ferrari. You have to remember that.
Yeah.
Tom?
Oh gosh, put me on a spot here.
Yeah. Part of the fun.
I've had so many cars, and not to brag, but it's hard to place myself in any one car that I didn't want to get out of, that I really loved. It's hard to say. I'm sorry. I'm dry. And you had that question before.
Yeah.
I just think, oh man, I don't come up with anything.
I think we both agree the race car.
Race cars. It's
the-
all about race cars.
The GTP car, the Porsche 962, was the ultimate.
Steve never
That's an
drove.
okay answer, by the way.
Steve never drove this Ferrari Daytona that we acquired, but it was a blast to drive, and it made neat noises, and it just was a gorgeous car. I drove it 2 or 3 times in these vintage car races, but the car that really, of the old cars that we didn't race in during the day, I drove a McLaren M8F Can-Am car. It was so exhilarating to drive. I can't begin to tell you how it was, other than the fact that it had a 500 cubic inch all aluminum engine, and the car would come out of a turn like a AA fuel dragster with burning the rubber almost all the way off down the whole straightaway. But what an amazing car. And it was so tractable and easy to drive. It was a nifty car.
I still daydream a little bit about the 962 and how you tell me about how much power that car had and what it took to slow it down
Yeah, that was.
at the end of the straightaway.
You had to both feet on the brake pedal and shoving it as hard as you could, lap after lap after lap, because that thing was heavy. But it had brakes this big, and they were glowing red too by the end of the of hard braking zone.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm sure.
yeah.
Got a couple of neat pictures of those in the one that you own and then the one that Bob Aiken that you drove on my office wall at home.
Yeah, that car was hindered by, they won the year before, with
Yeah.
Joe Gartner and Goodyear tires, but we inherited the Yokohama tires, and we were in the pits more than we should have been because they didn't last very well. So, but that car had.
Yeah. I got one last question. You've got a billboard. And what does it say?
One saying that I've heard in my Bible group, I forget who the philosopher was, but it's all about your persona, and it's who you are. Speak so loud, I can't hear what you say you are. Meaning, you are who you are, and people perceive you that way, and you can't put any shade on it or sunlight. It is what it is, and that's who you will always be. So if you're telling people that you're something other than how you're behaving, does that make sense?
Yeah, it's your actions speaking louder than your words, right?
Who you are, speak so loudly, I can't hear what you say you are.
Yeah, I love that.
So I mean, that's my billboard.
God has given me the desires of my heart.
Yeah. Guys, this has been great. This is all I got for you, but we've been talking about it for a couple of years now, and so happy to bring you on and share a name with you. And thank you so much for joining Like a Champion.
Thanks, Wesser. Enjoyed it.
It's an honor.
It's an honor. Thank you.
Here we go. Do it, Dan.
Proper.
That's a wrap.
That's a wrap.
Thank you, guys.